again, and welcome to the concluding presentation of Interfaith Scholar Weekend 2022. It is my pleasure as the chair of the Interfaith Scholarship Weekend to once again let you know that we have had 3 presentations thus far, and the presenters have been able to open up for us a whole different and much deeper understanding of Sabbath economics, ancient wisdom for modern crises. We are so pleased that they've been able to share for 3 different moments, deeper and more practical ways that we could be adopting a different lifestyle based on a much more profound understanding of what Sabbath could be for us in this world in which we live at this moment. On behalf of the Interfaith Scholar Weekend, I'd like to begin the program today by bringing on to our community a person that has been able to share with us already before something of a grounding in her Indigenous community, reminding us of a land acknowledgement and the importance of creation and the land and the people on whose land we are now standing. So Reverend Ana Maria Lopez Tenbears, would you once again remind us why we are here and introduce us to the community that you are representing today at an annual meeting?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody. It is, again, a heartfelt honor to sit in circle. I am coming from New Thought Community, our annual membership meeting, where we acknowledge all of our volunteers, and our whole community church is volunteer run. So we just step into spirit, and we're going to do that right now as we step into and step upon and greet happily in this land acknowledgement as we honor the tribes that are local, the Yokuts, the Miwoks, the Chukchansi, and the Mono. We've gathered in this ancient circle of sacred wisdom to recognize all brothers and sisters and all sentient beings. We walk this great earth of Pachamamita with the knowledge and heartbeat. We walk together in this sacred healing path. We walk together upon this great red road. And we remember that from 7 generations back to today, to 7 generations forward, we carry this sacred knowledge within us, and each step upon Earth Mother, as we greet each other heart to heart as Great Spirit, we give thanks. Aho mitakiyo yasen. Thank you and blessings to all your relations. Thank you. Aho.
Thank you, Reverend Ana Maria Lopez Tenbears, for once again reminding us of the beauty of the land, the beauty of the people, and our need to be respectful as we move forward from this moment on. Usually at this point, I have been introducing our 2 speakers, usually reading something that they have written, something that I have found interesting about them from before. But today I am just gonna, without a single note in front of me, thank them for who they are and what they have been doing for the world for the last 3 decades and counting. Ched and Elaine have become this dynamic duo of positive energy in the interfaith world, grounding us in so many different ways because of the Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries. They have written books, written many, many essays and articles, but more than that, they have witnessed for us these last 2 days how 2 people can bring together an energy that as individuals, they may not have had totally. The idea of cooperating and partnering in a ministry for the enrichment, not only of their individual group, which would be evangelical Mennonites, but instead they have embraced with that group so many others, such as our group today of Interfaith Scholar Weekend. Thank you both, Chet and Elaine, for what you've done so far with the first 3 presentations, and for today, that you will open up for us your latest book and all the work that has led up to being with us today. Thank you, God bless, and the rest of the afternoon is for Ched and Elaine to conclude for us what I think may have been the best of our 25 Interfaith Scholar Weekends. Thank you so much, Chet and Elaine.
Oh, thank you, Jim. Thank you for your very warm welcome and your kind words. We are so delighted to have spent this weekend with you and with the Fresno Interfaith Scholars Weekend. So friends, welcome all of you back to our final session. Thank you for joining us one last time to complete the circle of our weekend together. Please, in the chat, list who you are and greet one another as we begin talking together. Happy spring equinox, which is also the first day of the Iranian New Year, a tradition rooted in Persian Zoroastrianism. May this turning of seasons animate a deeper commitment to the ways of Sabbath economics. We are so grateful for the great Zoom producing of Ebony yesterday. Again, Jim Grant, for your enthusiasm, for Reverend Anna and Rabbi Laura's land acknowledgements, and for the help of Mark Baker and Susan Taylor monitoring your chat and questions. And today we have Katarina Friesen of Fresno Wild Church who will be doing this for us. And finally, a special warm greeting to all of my Mennonite colleagues who have been with us and tuning in during this series. So far, our consideration of the shadow cast by the Mammon system has focused on the plagues that threaten our future as a society, indeed as a planet. But this shadow also reaches deep into our past. This afternoon, we will look at Sabbath as reparative justice, as the ultimate expression of Jubilee faith, and see how it calls us to heal the oldest and deepest wounds on our continent by facing the ghosts and unresolved legacies of settler colonialism, Indigenous displacement, and white supremacy. We want to start by honoring one more prophetic woman. Before becoming the first Native person to serve in a president's cabinet, Deb Haaland's life looked a lot different. In the mid-1990s, she was a single parent, relying on food stamps and self-employment and struggling to pay for college. But she got through law school, then entered statewide politics in New Mexico, was elected to Congress in 2019, and this week was her anniversary of becoming Secretary of the Interior. She now oversees nation-to-nation relationships with hundreds of federally recognized tribes. She manages and protects millions of acres of land. She has established the Missing and Murdered Unit at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and she is tackling the Indian boarding school legacy. So let us be sure to support this brave advocate in her public service. Yesterday morning, we looked briefly at the Jubilee tradition as the most robust expression of Sabbath economics. At the completion of a week of years, or about every 2 generations, the Israelites were to significantly restructure their society in order that their human tendency to drift toward disparity and overreach might be mitigated through collective disciplines of redistribution. This radical vision has, of course, rarely been realized in the long arc of Western civilization. And indeed, many scholars insist it was never actually practiced. This is testimony to how thoroughly our history has been colonized by the spirit and story of Mammon. But the Jubilee Covenant has not been entirely forgotten. We saw how the African American community has lived and died by its hope. Indeed, we all stand in their debt for keeping this tradition alive. And we suggested yesterday that our country is haunted by this unrealized Jubilee vision of liberty and justice for all. Recent campaigns for Black reparations, global peace, and efforts to link the Shemitah to racial justice have followed in these footsteps. So as we conclude our conversation about Sabbath economics this weekend, we wish to look more deeply into of how the powerful theme of Jubilee justice can heal historical violations.
Scholars have also helped recover the lost covenant of Jubilee. We want to pause to honor the recent passing of some dear friends and mentors. In 1979, Hebrew Bible scholar Norman Gottwald wrote an epoch-turning study of the origins of biblical Israel, showing, among other things, how the Sabbath economics principles of mutual aid and non-hierarchical politics shaped the early Yahwist tribal confederacy. Norman's scholarship has inspired people around the world to reread sacred texts through the lens of justice. I was a student of Norman's, and my first book, which adopted his approach in a commentary on one of the Second Testament Gospels, would simply not have been published without his support and advocacy. This dear elder, teacher, and friend crossed over the Jordan just 10 days ago up in the Bay Area, and we are really mourning his loss. At the turn of the millennium, in collaboration with the aforementioned Jubilee 2000 debt relief campaign, I published this little booklet to support that amazing international movement. And as mentioned yesterday, we just reissued it, and you can order it on our site. At the same time, two other friends and mentors, Ross and Gloria Kinsler, were publishing a companion volume entitled The Biblical Jubilee and the Struggle for Life. We were working together to spread the scriptural vision of Sabbath economics among North American churches. So we also want to honor these longtime Presbyterian workers for justice in Central America. In 2014, we named our annual institute after the Kinslers, who we have now also lost. Ross to COVID and Gloria to dementia. We miss them greatly. Over the last 2 decades, however, more studies have emerged from different quarters, including from Canada, Singapore, and India, which, like Gottwald and the Kinslers, argue that the ancient Jubilee vision is still relevant. So if you're interested in the theological side of this movement, be assured that there's no lack of resources to fire our imaginations.
But what kind of Jubilee might make right injustices of the past? And how do we empower communities of both victims and perpetrators to be released from the burdens of historical violations? The first person to mentor me in this aspect of the work of restorative justice was the great Cheyenne Peace Chief, Lawrence Hart. He labored to correct monuments that tell only the white settler colonial side of history, thus disappearing Indigenous peoples from our landscapes, and to repatriate Native remains from museums and universities, so that the bones of Indigenous peoples confiscated from 19th century colonial battlefields might be returned to their ancestral lands and properly buried. A traditional peace chief, Elder Lawrence was deeply committed to telling the truth in order to heal. He too passed into the cloud of witnesses just 2 weeks ago in Kansas. So we wish to celebrate and mourn him today. We've taken a moment to honor these 4 beloved elders, now of blessed memory, as a reminder that how movements have been shaped over time matters, because the struggle for restorative justice stretches across generations, indeed centuries, which is why our last lecture looks back in order to move forward. Our new book, Healing Haunted Histories, A Settler Discipleship of Decolonization, explores how to reckon with historic wounds that still fester. We'll briefly summarize just 3 aspects of the larger argument of this project. First, we'll unpack the notion of hauntings as a way of framing the colonial dis-ease among and within us settlers. Second, we'll look at decolonization as the work of restorative solidarity. And lastly, we'll tackle the thorny issue of reparations by considering just one more ancient Jubilee scriptural text, the gospel story of Zacchaeus. Again, feel free to type your questions and comments into the chat as we go. At the end of our talk, we'll offer all of you intrepid ISW participants a special discount off our book if you are interested in pursuing these themes.
This is a picture of the Gaviota Coast, northwest of Santa Barbara, where my family used to camp when I was a teenager. It was and is the heart of Chumash country, the first peoples of our region. We often camped out in Tehiguas Canyon, the former site, I learned later, of the Chumash village of Tashiwa. One year, my dad called our attention to an old coast live oak not far from our campsite. It was adorned with this arborglyph, dating to the early 1800s and thought to be a Chumash rendering of a neophyte, that is, someone forcibly taken into the Spanish mission system, kneeling before a Franciscan padre. It was my first exposure as an already alienated teenager growing up in an unchurched home to the heavy footprint of the Spanish colonization of California. Though at the time, we just called it the Indian tree, with no further context or conversation. Only much later did I awaken to the true history of my home place, with its layers of Spanish and then Mexican and then American domination, as recently outlined by native Californian Elias Castillo. So this fading photo has hung on my walls for decades as a haunting.
UC Santa Barbara sociologist Avery Gordon, in her important book, Ghostly Matters, asserts that haunting is a constituent element of modern social life through which repressed or unresolved social violence makes itself known in everyday life, especially when they are supposedly over and done with, slavery, for instance, or when their oppressive nature is continuously denied. Yet importantly, Gordon also emphasizes how reckoning with these ghosts can mobilize individual, social, or political movement and change, but only if they are faced. To illustrate what is meant here, we need to look no further than the murder of George Floyd, a Minneapolis policeman, less than 2 years ago. As you all are aware, it brought up yet again the ghosts of a long-standing history of violence towards Black and brown bodies in our white-dominant American body politic. This powerful haunting spread across time and space, even as far away as war-torn Syria. In a similar vein, just a few days ago, we commemorated the 1-year anniversary of the horrible murders of 8 Asian American women in the Atlanta spa shootings. Our American landscape is indeed full of ghosts, especially those lingering from centuries of colonization and genocide. The roots of settler colonialism lie in European Christianity, medieval explorers were granted by popes the right and duty to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all pagans whatsoever, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the possessions and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. These ecclesial and later legal doctrines have justified the long and bitter history of European entitlement to other people's lands and resources around the world, as overviewed by a recent film by Indigenous historian Steve Newcomb. It is a legacy Christian churches have yet to fully reckon with. And we commend the work of our colleague Kat Friesen, there in Fresno, with the National Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition. This shadow of colonization soon reached California. While various European powers were busy colonizing the eastern part of North America, Spain was claiming most of Latin America and our Southwest, including what is today called California, which until the late 18th century was understood as an island, as shown in this old map. As you know, the keystone strategy for Spain's colonization of California was a system of 21 missions, each about a day's horse ride apart. Our friend and colleague Jonathan Cordero, a Chumash Ohlone sociologist, has starkly summarized what this meant for Indigenous Californians. Almost 80% died in the missions. They lost their language, their culture, their communities, their land, and they became subjugated at the bottom rung of society. In 1821, Mexico became independent from Spain and secularized the missions in California, further disenfranchising the remnant Indigenous population. The Mexican-American War paved the way for the American occupation of the Southwest, sealed in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Within months, we might note, after gold was discovered in California. If the Spanish and Mexican colonization shattered most coastal Indigenous communities in California, the American period brought nothing less than disaster throughout the whole state, as UCLA historian Benjamin Madley has recently chronicled in detail. Here we might pause and ask ourselves, how well do we know this history? In 1852, the new state of California made 18 treaties with Native groups, but these were never ratified by the federal government and were literally hidden away for 50 years. As a result, many Indigenous bands here are still landless and federally unrecognized. Between 1846 and 1873, it is estimated that settlers murdered more than 16,000 Indigenous Californians, while tens of thousands were additionally starved or worked to death. Acts of enslavement, kidnapping, rape, child separation, and displacement were widespread and were encouraged, tolerated, and carried out by state authorities and militia. It is estimated that the Indigenous population of California decreased during this period by 80%. This genocidal legacy is what Dr. King, to whom we've turned at several points this weekend, called the original sin of our country, predating even slavery. In his 1963 book, Why We Can't Wait, almost 60 years old now, King continues. Those of us who desire to liberate ourselves from this tangled web of prejudice have not yet fully grasped how deeply it has been woven into our consciousness. Then he concludes, we must X-ray our history and reveal the full extent of the disease. His was a courageous and prescient diagnosis, a challenge which we take to heart in our book.
Continuing our overview of colonization in California, with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, over the next century, the state's population doubled in size every 10 years, thanks to a flood of in-migration by white Easterners. You've perhaps seen this famous image before. It was originally a railroad poster that sought to assure Eastern Americans that it was safe to settle in the far Wild West. But it's a text worth exegeting because in it, medieval theological doctrines of discovery morph into the thoroughly secular ideology of progress as manifest destiny. The image celebrates the unstoppable march of white domination over the continent. Notice in the foreground, this is led by militia, followed closely by resource extractors, then farmers, then locomotives. A fairly accurate summary of 19th century colonization. The sun rises behind the Mississippi River while indigenous peoples, together with buffalo and bear, flee into a darkening horizon. And that's not an angel in the middle, but the mythic image of Columbia, the feminized version of Columbus, as a personification of America. She lays telegraph wire with her left hand, but that's not a Bible in her right hand. It's a school book. The mythology of empire and unapologetic white supremacy, celebrated here in another piece of 19th century propagandizing art, this one still hanging in the US Capitol. It's deep in our bones. But here's the deal. This isn't just about the Catholic missions or the pioneer story of the last century, because every one of us of non-Indigenous heritage and our ancestors who settled in California were just following that trail of colonization, its logic, and its historical momentum. Let me use I'm a fifth generation Californian. My dad's maternal side were all Californios, Mexican Californians. My great-great-grandfather, Francisco Mendoza, was pushed to Turtle Island by the tide of European revolutions in 1848, escaping from Portugal to Mexico and then coming north to Sonora, California, so named because Mexican gold miners were congregated and segregated there. He married Inés Núñez, who was born in Mexico in 1829, and they settled in Miwok territory. Their second daughter, Maria Rosario, married Luis Guerena, a saloon keeper. Their daughter, Inés Belle, was my grandmother. She married a German American whose father had worked his way west with the railroads. Their only son was my father. The hard times of the Great Depression pulled this family from Sonora to San Francisco, traditional Ohlone territory. There, my dad shared a room with his abuela Maria, who still spoke mostly Spanish. My dad assimilated so he could realize the American dream, and he did make it, surviving World War II in Korea, then becoming a successful businessman at the price of exiling his cultural raza, and resettling in 1950s Los Angeles, traditional Tongva territory. Here's my point. These resettlements, like those of your families, followed the colonial pattern, an unexamined entitlement to inhabit any place one could get to. I carry all of these things, these unresolved contradictions in my bones, and so do you.
I too am a resettler in California, though born and raised in Canada. I am really feeling the weight of the current war because, like Rabbi Laura, my ancestors were from Ukraine. The backbone narrative of our book is about my grandparents, who a century ago were also suffering under a Russian war, and who arrived as refugees from Bolshevik and Stalinist violence to the Canadian prairies in the 1920s. They settled near Cree communities in Saskatchewan, where Mennonite farmers were actively being recruited by the Canadian government to help domesticate the prairies. My grandparents were traumatized immigrants, yet Indigenous peoples had endured far greater trauma by 100 years of colonial dispossession and suppression. So these two haunted communities struggled to survive side by side, with almost no connection between them. That is until recently, since Cree hospitality and activism and Mennonite solidarity are beginning to change the story. Healing Haunted Histories helps settlers X-ray our personal and political histories to encourage, challenge, and capacitate people of faith and conscience to, one, understand how our histories, landscapes, and communities are haunted by long and continuing history of Indigenous dispossession wrought by settler colonialism. Two, to transform the self-understanding lifeways and structures we inhabit. And three, to practice restorative solidarity with Indigenous communities as part of a wider movement of decolonization. We focus on how to critically trace our family lines in order to understand how we are products of historical processes of violence and dispossession, sometimes as victims, sometimes as perpetrators, sometimes both. We discuss tools for exploring our communal histories, tracing and analyzing place, people, and spirit, our storylines. We call these strands of communal narrative landlines, past and present places of inhabitation, bloodlines, family and community, race and ethnicity, and songlines, the liberative traditions that inspire practices of justice and compassion. We encourage readers to explore, interrogate, and decolonize these strands. The simple poll that Ebony will put up for us now gives a taste, just a taste, of some of the questions we look at in the book. So please just take a few minutes, all anonymous yes and no questions. Ebony, how many folks have participated?
22 out of 51.
Oh, friends, let's do a few more. Let's do just a few more.
Some of these questions are a little bit harder, but equally important as the ones we were wrestling with yesterday.
Well, and we don't know a lot of these answers. I mean, that is the
It's
point.
okay not to know.
It is okay not to know. All right. I think we should just let's show us the results, Ebony. Yeah, I mean, of course, we spend a lot of time on these issues in the book, but the fact that 41% of you do know your grandmama's name is significant. And wow, the fact that 80% of you still speak that language is very shocking. That's really something. Wonderful. Language retention is such a huge piece of our cultural awareness and retention.
Retention is only 23%.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was reading that wrong. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
So in other words, you know the language, most of you know
Oh,
the
I
language
see.
of your ancestors, but only less than a quarter of you speak it. That's much more in line with the American story of assimilation.
Yeah, and one of the things we look at in our book is a spectrum of volition, why our ancestors came in the first place, looking at forced migration of slavery all the way to an opportunist. And so the reflection here of 33% being under a type of forced migration is also significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of work to do on knowing the indigenous tribes who lived in the place where our forebears came, right? That's part of the erasure of colonization. And 3/4 of us have got great work to do, and good chance for a study group on this book.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then almost 80% of you do know the name of the indigenous tribe where you live now, which is a good practice.
Thanks perhaps to the great land acknowledgements we've been having.
And it is good also to see that there is a spiritual tradition that empowers us, that we've inherited from ancestors.
And yet more of us have not been involved with local Native communities than have. So again, these are just quick snapshots of the work that we have to do. And it looks like most of you feel like you do have spaces where you can explore these issues, and that's very, very good. Thank you, Ebony. We can close the poll.
And thank you, friends, for participating in that, just to give us a little bit of all of us a sense of the issues we're looking at and the issues we need to work on. Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck explains why it is important to attend to the past. Settler colonialism, which she defines as the management of those who have been made killable, is the oldest and longest haunted history in North America. She says, so that settler society and haunting are inextricably bound. Each ensures there are always more ghosts to return. That's why it is so crucial for us settlers to face the full extent of the disease, as Dr. King put it. A half millennium of colonization in North America has left a legacy of violation and genocide that inhabits every intersection of settler and indigenous worlds, past and present. How do we repair our relations with and realize justice for our continent's indigenous and other marginalized peoples? For us, healing hauntings is a lifelong journey of both inward and outward, into repentance, transformation, and solidarity. In our work, we use the metaphor of peeling the proverbial onion with all the accompanying tears. The hauntings go that deep in our individual and collective spirits. We long for our faith communities to be places where we settlers can nurture the courage to peel the onion, to learn to feel the pain of our entanglement in racism and colonization, past and present, and to heal. The emotional labor of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks having to share their pain so we can get it is too costly. Our work cannot be sustained on other people's pain, nor on their strength. This is our onion to peel. The great Black activist and writer Audre Lorde called this doing our own work, breaking silences that always seem dangerous to us. But of course, we settlers would prefer to avoid this hard work. And here we'll just mention two key ways that we try to exonerate ourselves from responsibility of the many that we explore in the book.
The most typical strategy is to presume our settler innocence through what Canadian scholars call colonial agnosia. Our disconnection from a fraught past is not, they argue, simply a matter of collective amnesia or omission. Rather, it is an act of ignoring, an aggressive act of ignoring, that inhabits our emotions and spirituality and our educational systems and media in ways that render our entanglements in colonization just too difficult to understand. In other words, we don't know about the past and continuing injustices, and we don't want to know. Another widespread move to innocence is disassociation, embracing an ahistorical individualism that understands the self as a free-floating entity, untethered and unaccountable to a past which is not our fault. Two other Canadian theorists call this transcendent, the foreclosure of knowledge, in which the settler must believe that history is in the past and that any and all harm, trauma, and associated accountability is just not relevant. As a result, they assert, we are literally sick at heart and soul, making it difficult to look each other in the eye without weariness.
Contemporary Indigenous activist Nikki Sanchez summarizes the whole matter more simply and succinctly. This history is not your fault, but it is absolutely your responsibility. The same year that King wrote the essay we quoted earlier, James Baldwin wrote his famous essay entitled The Fire Next Time. In it, he argued that white people are still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. There is that Jubilee term, release. To reckon with this history is not to drown in shame, paralysis, or denial. Baldwin insisted, but to use it for liberation, because an invented past cannot help us. It will crumble under the pressures of reality. Now that is a word for our time of resurgent fake news and fairy tale historical narratives. In our 2009 book, Ambassadors of Reconciliation, we explored how principles of restorative justice might be applied to historic injustices. And in this new book, we build this out, identifying 3 core commitments that can animate and empower personal and political practices of what we call restorative solidarity. One is to do our own work around issues like agnosia and dissociation, white fragility, ethnic loss and assimilation, and the impact of intergenerational trauma and moral injury, in order to understand our own deformation by and entanglement in the legacy and structures of settler colonialism. To listen to how Indigenous and other communities injured by historic and current injustices are identifying harms, needs, and responsibilities, and to work with these communities to make things as right as possible, including covenants of accountability, restitution, reparations, repatriation, and perhaps, over time, reconciliation. This process is an ongoing circle. As we keep working around these practices and learning from them, our next steps, just like the Sabbath Economics Household Covenant work we spoke about yesterday. You might recall that toward the end of our first night's talk, we used the notion popular in Canada. Our decolonization work is to become treaty people, as an analogy for the old scriptural exhortations to embrace old covenants for modern crises. So here is a summary of 4 restorative solidarity practices that will empower this journey, what we call the 4 R's for decolonization. The first step is to deepen our literacy in the realities of Indigenous communities. Since 2007, our annual Bartimaeus Kinsler Institutes have curated spaces for serious reschooling at the intersection of sanctuary, seminary, streets, and soil. They experiment with instruction and inspiration that engage not only our heads, but also our hearts, hands, and spirits. We have recently focused on critical exploration of our landlines, bloodlines, and songlines. Such brave spaces are crucial for settler people of faith, trying to deepen our journeys of decolonization. So what are these spaces for you? Our mentor, Harry Lafond, emphasizes that relationship building is essential to solidarity. Former chief of the Muskeg Lake Cree Band and director of the Office of the Treaty Commissioners of Saskatchewan, Harry and his partner Jermaine are well known around Saskatchewan for how they have welcomed settlers to their reserve and shared stories, food, song, and culture. We know that ISW is one space in Fresno for intercultural relationship building. What are the others? Third, it's crucial that we settlers, as we learn to listen to Indigenous concerns, show up in meaningful ways to support, accompany, and stand with communities engaged in righting past and present wrongs. Many faith-rooted settler activists are joining Indigenous colleagues around pipeline issues, from Standing Rock to Wet'suwet'en, or marching with Native water walkers who teach in a traditional way the importance of eco-justice. Ultimately, however, our practices of decolonization must lead to redistributive justice, including reparations. Now, keep in mind that in both Canada and the US, Indigenous reserves and reservations constitute only 0.2% of the total landmass. Repatriation of land and life is the central goal of decolonization for Indigenous leaders, as recently popularized in the hashtag #LandBack movement. We know that talk of reparations spikes our settler anxieties and that we typically dismiss it as too complicated or unrealistic. But we settler people of faith can and must organize together with Indigenous colleagues concerning power, money, and land justice, because we all still live and worship on Indigenous lands. Reparations is the embodiment of Jubilee as the culmination of Sabbath economics. But it is also the most difficult step for us settlers. After all, redistributive justice is considered high heresy in Mammon culture. So we need one more dose of scriptural encouragement.
So let's return to the gospel. Throughout Luke's narrative, Jesus is pretty hard on rich people. For example, following on the heels of the story of the defective manager, which we looked at yesterday morning, comes Jesus' rant about God versus Mammon, and then the infamously damning parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Note that both stories begin with the same phrase, there was a rich man who. And there are many more such stories, which will be the subject of my next book entitled Jesus Against Plutocracy, Sabbath Economics in Luke's Gospel. But the final strand in this thread in Luke is the story of Zacchaeus. It's actually a diptych preceded by Jesus' encounter with a street beggar who is both poor and blind. It's the last sequence before Jesus enters Jerusalem in the story to meet his fate, a twinning that therefore represents the denouement of Luke's narrative. Because though Jesus' insistence that justice demands redistribution of resources will probably be perceived as bad news by wealthy readers of Luke's story, like us, here it is revealed as good news for both those sickened by deprivation and disparity and for those suffering from the killing disease of affluenza. In American churches, Zacchaeus is portrayed as a fat little man with no particular social identity. There's even a Sunday school song about him. Yeah, I know that some of you know it. But such sentimentalizing obscures the real economic terrain of the first century and of this story. The tax collectors of this period were locals employed directly by the Roman occupying authorities to do something called tax farming, making a living from commissions on tolls and customs. Because of their extortion as agents of the imperial occupation, tax collectors were understandably rejected socially and viewed politically as economic traitors. The collector, therefore, would have been the most rapacious and thus the most despised. Zacchaeus' headquarters were in Jericho, a center for trade in the Judean frontier and the port of entry for all traffic crossing the River Jordan from the east. Most translations depict Zach as short, but the Greek term helikia usually means young in age. And that means he likely inherited his lofty position through family patronage to the Herodian royal house, whose winter palace was in Jericho. So Zach, at the top of the social pyramid, is an archetypal contrast to the unnamed poor man in the preceding story, who was at the bottom, having endured years of marginalization and invisibility. Kind of another Lazarus and Divus setup, but with a very different outcome. We're told that Zach was trying to see Jesus. This connects him with the beggar in the previous episode. They both want to see, and they're both blind, though in different ways. Luke thus binds the fate of these two characters tightly together, though they inhabit opposite ends of the social spectrum. Impossible to bridge such a gulf? Well, here's why narrative details matter. The kind of tree Zach was sitting up in was a mulberry. Now, Jesus had something very specific to say earlier in the story about these kinds of trees. If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to a mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. You see, Jesus believed that another economic order was both imperative and possible. And here he challenges someone high up in that very tree to do something considered impossible. And in this story, Zacchaeus is indeed uprooted and replanted into the soil of Sabbath economics. Summoning Zacchaeus to come down from his perch, Jesus invites himself over for dinner, essentially demanding hospitality, a very strange, aggressive, and perhaps even risky strategy. But this surprise is immediately followed by another. Zach hurries down and welcomes Jesus joyfully. This is an unexpected and courageous pivot for someone of Zach's social standing who lives in the insular bubble of the wealthy. Just imagine this raggedy group trooping into his elegant home. But it's his first step of liberation. Of course, there's immediate resistance to this scandalous class mixing, no doubt from rich and poor alike, since the latter would object to socializing with an oppressor, which Zacchaeus certainly is. This apparently gives Zach pause. Perhaps it's dawning on him that by welcoming the homeless man Jesus, he's also receiving his entourage, now including the beggar of the previous story. So Luke tells us he stood still. Here's a second key connection to the blind beggar story. It's the same exact phrase that Jesus did when he heard the poor man's cry for help. He stopped, took the time to feel and hear the pain, as opposed to just walking by. Well, that mindfulness must have been contagious, because now it's Zach who stops dead in his tracks. This rhetorical repetition suggests that Zacchaeus has encountered not only Jesus, but the marginalized man as well. He sees the poor man likely for the first time, and that is his healing. You see, he realizes that Jesus is interested in more than hospitality. He perceives, perhaps because he's heard from other tax collectors about their encounters with this prophet, that Jesus' message demands actual redistribution of wealth to those on the other side of the socioeconomic divide. And that is exactly what Zach offers, unbidden, in the biggest surprise of the story. Unlike all the other rich men in Luke's narrative, Zach offers half his property to the poor, an extraordinary step for any of us, wouldn't you agree? However, let us be very clear that this should be considered restitution according to Torah. Exodus 22 says that if someone has stolen from someone else, he must restore equity and then some, 4 or 5-fold. Leviticus asserts that defrauding someone requires restitution of what was taken plus 20%, a principle that is adjudicated through rituals of accountability. Zach indeed entertains the prospect that he might have defrauded some folks, at which point one can imagine Jesus raising an eyebrow and saying, if, but Zach goes well beyond 20%. In other words, friends, he's making reparations. In celebration, Jesus makes an extraordinary response. He declares, today, salvation or deliverance has come to this house. He means this quite literally. When Jesus and all his funky friends entered Zach's home, they brought with them his liberation. It's the encounter that brings transformation. This calls to mind the first time Jesus interacted with tax collectors in Luke's story, way back in chapter 5. This also resulted in Jubilee hospitality, debtors and debt collectors sharing table fellowship. There too, objections were raised. After all, table fellowship was a primary determiner of social relations in antiquity. So such dramatic boundary crossing threatened the status quo. How Jesus responds there illuminates our story. You can't heal people who don't know they're sick, he says. Only those who sense that something is wrong with the system will be willing to turn history around. The meaning, remember, of repentance, which is to say that if we don't take a measure, full measure, of the extent of this disease, as King says, we won't be able to heal through personal and public transformation. Reparations then are about our liberation. By calling Zach a son of Abraham, Jesus is restoring his kinship with his people, just as he did with the blind beggar who had been cut off by poverty. And just as he did earlier in Luke's story, he healed a woman bent over by debt, liberating her on the Sabbath in Jubilee fashion, which he defends by similarly naming her as a daughter of Abraham. The beloved community of Israel, to borrow King's term, is restored only when the poorest debtor and the richest creditor in the family are both healed. One released from debt, the other released from affluenza by redistributing his wealth. Jesus concludes this encounter by making his mission clear, based upon his study of the Jubilee Bible. The bent-over woman and the blind beggar were dehumanized by economic disparity and were made right by being made whole in economic as well as physical and spiritual terms. But the chief tax collector is lost, hopelessly addicted to privilege and power, unless and until he restores equity. Sabbath economics is about healing for everyone. But for those of us trying to get a leg up in that Jericho tree, we who have too much, who have benefited materially from settler colonialism, who continue to enjoy white privilege, our hauntings will ultimately be healed only by making concrete reparations. So we'll close with just a few examples of how people of faith are experimenting with reparations as healing justice.
Florence Schlongneger, a Mennonite pastor and descendant of immigrants who settled in Kansas land in the late 1870s, gave $10,000, a portion of her share of her family homestead sale, to the Kansa Indigenous Heritage Society. This new organization works to maintain the legacy and memory of the people for whom Kansas is named, and to provide settlers avenues to make things right. Rich Snyder, a plumber, bought a remote piece of land in southern Colorado. Upon discovering Ute artifacts, he felt that the land was haunted and gave it, along with his cabin, to the Ute tribe in 2019. He is the first landowner in a campaign by the tribe to seek new rights and establish a new presence in their ancestral Colorado lands. Tribal Chairman Luke Duncan says, "We hope this can inspire others to take similar actions." It's even more powerful when institutions decide to make reparations, as this has a wider impact on other organizations. Today, many mainstream faith traditions face dwindling congregations and underused buildings, and some are closing their doors. Stony Point Presbyterian Church made this difficult decision in 2017, which led to a concrete gesture of repatriation, after the 2016 General Assembly repudiated the doctrine of discovery and called on all levels of PCUSA to enter into dialogue, strategy, and action with Indigenous people of the region as part of a process of confession and repentance to redress wrongs. Our friend Rick Uffer-Chase, former denominational moderator, had urged Stony Point Pres to explore with local Indigenous leaders a possible handover of the property. Discussions with Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Nation culminated in a 2019 giving of the former Stony Point Church and all its property to the newly created Sweetwater Cultural Center to promote the education, health, and welfare of Native peoples and to preserve their cultures and ceremonial practices. Recent grassroots experiments in voluntary taxing and civil distribution are another interesting experiment in redistributive justice. The Sogoreate Land Trust is an urban intertribal organization led by Indigenous women in Ohlone territory in the San Francisco Bay Area. It is working to rematriate urban land to Indigenous stewardship. A priority is to procure land where Ohlone can be properly reinterred, since every one of the 425 shell mounds or sacred burial grounds around the bay have been destroyed by development, while the remains of over 15,000 Ohlone are stored at local universities. Some local settlers, in consultation with Sogoreate, initiated the Shumi land tax, a voluntary payment that is both symbolic and substantive. Participants calculate the annual tax based on their rent or mortgage. These funds directly support Sogoreate's work to acquire and preserve land and build urban gardens and community centers so current and future generations of Indigenous peoples can thrive. There's an Oakland synagogue and a few churches there that are embracing the Shumi land tax, and similar symbolic tax initiatives have sprung up in Seattle, New York, and elsewhere. So this is just a sampling of many other such experiments that we explore in the book. None of them are heroic. Indeed, modest redistributions of settler surplus is hardly costly. But they represent beginning steps in a longer journey. Remember that first step adage that we looked at yesterday, which can animate more substantial efforts. On the broader political level, 2 years ago, Governor Newsom acknowledged the state's bloody history of oppression of Indigenous Californians and announced the creation of a statewide Truth and Healing Council, which has been meeting regularly. Kat Friesen, again, who is all with you there in Fresno, has been exploring conversations with the council and other opportunities to explore practices of restorative solidarity there locally. And so we've invited Kat to tell about some of the current highlights, but first, we do want to run another brief poll. Ebony, will you please run the reparations poll? It's short, it's 4 yes or no questions. Actually, it's only 3. Thank you, Ebony.
All right, friends, fortunately, this is anonymous, so you won't be getting a follow-up email to organize you, but depending on your answer, but let's go ahead and see the results, Ebony. All right, so we're about
Nice,
evenly
yeah.
split in terms of where your community is, but still we have a slight majority who are going to work on this to get this conversation going.
It is wonderful that 75% of you are interested in participating in a voluntary civil land tax. Yeah, it is a wonderful way that we can acknowledge the land that we are living on, and we are working to get that started here as well. It's very exciting. Yes. Wow, that 93% of you would support repatriation. That is very encouraging. It is a hard piece to get our heads around, and are grateful that folks are really taking it seriously and imagining ways that we can give some of that land back. Thank you for participating.
Yeah, you can close that, Ebony. Kat, that last poll is good news for you. Tell us some of what's going on there locally in Fresno.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation, Elaine and Ched, to share briefly just about some Indigenous-led reparative projects in our region that we're invited to get involved with and support. And if you know of any that I don't mention, please share them in the chat. So first, I want to highlight a new center in our area called Circle V Indigenous and Environmental Resource Center. And I'll put the link in the chat. This center is in the visioning stages now, and it's led by the Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival in collaboration with the U.S. Green Building Council of Central California and the San Joaquin River Conservancy, which some of you may be familiar with. And together they're envisioning a center on the bluffs that's overlooking the San Joaquin River on the edge of Madera and Fresno County. And this will highlight Indigenous cultures surrounding the river and will be a place where local tribes who've experienced so much displacement and violence can call home. The tribes want to take the lead in educating the wider public about Indigenous plants, languages, history, and cultures. They have volunteer days that are actually happening now every other Monday through the end of April, when you can go and visit the site, help out, and learn more about it. Carly Tex, who's Western Mono, is the executive director of the Language Survival nonprofit, and she's the main contact for that project. And then second, I want to highlight a project that the Wakchumni Yokuts tribe has developed in partnership with with land actually owned by a Quaker settler family called Quaker Oaks Farm. And that's Oaks as in O-A-K-S, not Oats Farm. I'll put the link in the chat to that project as well. And this is in Visalia. This farm was actually home once to a Wukchumni village before white settlers claimed the land. And now Darlene Franco's family and other Wukchumni families have returned to that land to revitalize their ceremonies and also to restore some of the Tule wetlands and to grow other native plants for food and basket making and other cultural uses. Before the pandemic, they also ran a spring service youth camp for Wukchumni, Mixtec, and non-native Quaker youth, where together they learned about Indigenous practices of caring for the land. So a really cool project there that I support and invite others to as well. And then finally, I want you to know about a local struggle for federal recognition. Many of you love Yosemite National Park. You might not know that because of the 18 secret treaties that Elaine mentioned earlier, treaties that were hidden away and never ratified by Congress, many California tribes aren't recognized by the federal government. And one of these tribes is the Southern Sierra Miwok Nation, whose homelands are within Mariposa County, where I grew up, and Yosemite National Park. During the gold rush, Indigenous peoples were killed, and many of you may not know, were forcibly removed by state-sponsored militias from the park, and yet they returned to Yosemite, and then they were removed a century later by the park, and yet returned again, and many continue to work in the park with the Park Service. So the Southern Sierra Miwok Nation has been struggling for over 40 years for federal recognition, and recognition would offer resources to restore their language, cultural practices, lands, offer college scholarships, and many other opportunities. So part of this in my mind is really just restitution from the federal government for the harms that they've experienced. So you can donate to their struggle. And also if you know people in the area in Mariposa County, or maybe who work for the park, please ask them to write a letter to show local support of this urgent petition. And it's pressing because their deadline for reapplication is in May. And I also invite you, whenever you visit Yosemite, consider donating as a guest on their lands as one of 7 traditionally affiliated tribes in Yosemite. They're actually rebuilding a cultural center, the Wahoga Cultural Center, as one small step to reclaiming tribal autonomy in the park and to continue their spiritual practices and cultural ceremonies on their own lands. So none of these projects are full repatriation of lands. I think the higher calling that Elaine and Ched invite us to, but they are all Indigenous-led land justice and I think healing projects, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all of us settlers and immigrants on these lands. And we have the opportunity to support them with our time and our talents and finances. And maybe considering the poll, we can even work together to organize a voluntary land tax. So thanks for that idea, Ched and Elaine. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Kat, for telling us of all great opportunities, lots of good work that is being done for Fresno, folks around Fresno to plug into. So thanks very much, Kat, and for the work that you do. Thank you. Mohawk educator Tayak Alfred sums up our work this way. For all of us, Indigenous and settler alike, there is only self-questioning and embracing this commitment. Listen to the voices of our Indigenous ancestors channeled through the young people of our nations. Learn from Indigenous culture how to walk differently and love the land as best you can. So we want to get back to the many things that Kat raised and also the questions that have come up, questions and comments that have come up in the chat. But before we open it up for conversation, we do want to let you know that if you would like haunted histories, you can go to this website at the bottom of the page there, healinghauntedhistories.org, and order through Whippenstock. There's a button to push that says you want to order through Whippenstock. You go to that page and there they ask for this coupon code right there. Write that down and that will give you a 40% off discount until the end of this month. So please take advantage of that if you would like to do that. We're also organizing online study groups around the country, so let us know if you want to join in one. So let us open it up for question and answer on how we can support one another to leaning into Sabbath economics, and really we can open it up all weekend, but focusing specifically on reparations and Indigenous justice, how we can lean into that work going forward together. So Kat, what has come up in the chat?
Well, Elaine and Ched, so far we don't have any questions, so I invite folks to put their questions in the chat, but we have some comments. Bob Foxworth quoted William Faulkner as saying, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," when you were sharing about that kind of denial of history. And then along with that, Arrington Chambly said, shared a James Baldwin quote, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history." So some rich quotes for reflection that you're welcome to comment on. And I invite others to share questions, and I could start off with one or two if you'd like as well.
Well, Kat, why don't you start out by letting folks know how they can get involved with the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition?
Sure. Yeah, I'm part of a group of Mennonites and Anabaptist people of faith who work nationally and internationally to accompany Indigenous peoples in their struggles for land justice today, and really look at the ways that the doctrine of discovery continues. The philosophical and legal structure that Elaine and Ched mentioned is embedded in our legal systems that govern land title today. And so to this day, Indigenous peoples are among the most vulnerable peoples whose lands are exploited. And as you know, have heard of the Keystone XL pipeline, to oil drilling, to gold mining extraction in other parts of the world, are often those most displaced from their lands. So they can get involved by actually reaching out to me. I'm the organizer, and we're bringing on another organizer, Sarah Augustine, later this year. So you can support her salary campaign online. You can ask a speaker to come and speak in your congregation. I've shared in several in the Fresno area. I've also been trained in an exercise through Mennonite Central Committee called Loss of Turtle Island. It's a great intro activity visualizing land loss by the use of blankets slowly taken away over time. And then we talk about what are ways settlers can be part of the healing movements that Indigenous peoples are leading for land justice today. So feel free to reach out to me. Those are some ways. We have different committees working on educational resources for churches, as well as on challenging laws and policies that continue to oppress Indigenous folks today, and really seeking to be a church that is taking responsibility for the harms of the past, seeing the ways they continue today, and working for healing where there's shalom, justice for all. So I'll put my email in the chat actually, and you can reach out about that.
We're noticing a question from Laura. Kat, while you're doing that work, we'll try to address what Laura has written here. Can you say more? I'm just dropping to the bottom of it, about why the stories we tell or are subject to or require scrutiny are so important in shaping reality. Yeah, thank you, Laura, for that question. Part of my research was looking at the communal narratives that our Mennonite community tells in the Canadian prairies. And this is specifically the 1,000 Mennonites that came out of Russia and Ukraine in the 1920s. The communal narratives had some very consequential silences. And one of the silences, and this is not, of course, unique to the settler Mennonite community. I think all settler communities have parts of these narratives, but one that just kept bubbling up to the surface was the erasure of Indigenous peoples, and that attitude. There was no knowledge about how our Mennonite forebears, first in Ukraine and Russia, displaced Nogai and Bashkir, the Indigenous people there. And then in coming to Saskatchewan, beginning in the Manitoba, really in the 80s, displacement of Indigenous peoples. Then as Mennonites moved west and settled in Saskatchewan, displacement of more Indigenous peoples. Just that that narrative of we came to an empty land. There were no people here before that. And of course, that's not unique to settler Mennonites. That's a trope that is a myth that is a part of many settler communities. Also, a story that we tell is that we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, and it was through our faith in God and our hard work and our perseverance that brought us to where we are now. And again, in dealing with communal narratives, we want to be careful and acknowledge, of course, there was perseverance, there was hard work, there was faith, but there was also a lot of privileges that were extended. And again, particularly, I know the story of the Mennonite community coming to Saskatchewan. And so government incentives and travel debts being forgiven, and farming loans and land being given for cheap, all of these stories that are not a part of the communal narrative. And then there's a whole piece of the communal narrative where women's stories were silenced and untold, and the experiences of violence that they experienced during the revolution were really buried, and that silence had a huge impact on who we are today.
You might remember yesterday we talked about Jesus' double vision, and I think on this question about how we narrate our story, we need to practice a double vision. On one hand, being more critically engaged with some of the myths of our own communal narratives, and on the other hand, being much more curious about literacy in Indigenous versions of history and of the stories that the land holds. So this is a really important part of decolonization work, for sure.
It's a twofold, right? The how we tell the stories, first of the stories of our landlines, bloodlines, songlines, but then also the stories of Indigenous, learning those stories of their landlines, bloodlines, and songlines. Thank you, Laura.
And we have another question in the Q&A chat here from John Mark. What resources do you have for sermon series and Bible studies in our churches? And this might be the last question that we have time for.
Thank you, Kat.
Again, we really commend this book, which has an extensive bibliography on both those counts, as one resource for sermons and for scripture study.
And you should say, I mean, we take on 4, at least, major scripture studies in there.
Yeah, so that's the reason why we wanted to put this rather long book together, was so that it could be a resource. And in this resource, you'll find pointers to other resources as well. There's a lot of resources on the DoD page as well that Kat put in the chat. And we would encourage the ISW circle to share resources between your congregations and between your traditions, because everybody's working, remember that jigsaw puzzle, everybody's working a part of that puzzle. And we really want you all to support each other going forward in this work, and help each other transform your traditions. So thank you, Kat, for your work. Yeah, one of the books mentioned in Healing Haunted History is Buffalo Shout, Salmon Cry, which again came out of Mennonite Struggles. There's just a lot of stuff that's being generated. It's a real Renaissance time right now, and we want to encourage you all. And so,
Thank you. We just want to turn once again to the Venerable James Baldwin for a benediction, which sums up the rationale for all of the work that we have explored this weekend. He writes, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So friends, thank you. We so appreciate you being with us this weekend, you taking the time, many hours out of your weekend to have these conversations with us. And of course, a big thank you to the Interfaith Scholars Weekend Committee for inviting us and organizing these wonderful conversations every year. And so now we just want to turn it over to Jim for the final word.
Thank you so much, everyone who has been participating in this phenomenal weekend. I asked for 5 minutes at the end, and I think I have 6, but I will not use them all up if I don't have to. But I have 7 things I have to say. First of all, regarding silence, I really think I am hoping that Pope Francis will address. He had hoped to come to Canada. He had hoped to come and address the issue of the residential atrocities that in this country and in Canada, the church inflicted on Indigenous people. There needs to be a complete addressing of the injustice. So that's my first thought, that one fruit of this will be to pursue with our churches the silence over how we have so unjustly treated the Indigenous community of this country. Secondly, I really can't thank enough, but I've tried to thank Ched and Elaine for everything that they have shared with us over these 3 days. Not only what they did with us while here, but for the years of planning and for all of the work they've done, for the PDF that they're making available for $5 to be able to get an 80-page document all about the biblical foundation of Sabbath economics. I want to thank Melinda Pateri, who set up 2 years ago the connection with Ched and Elaine. This could never have happened without her work with you over these years. I then have to name off all the participants in Interfaith Scholar Weekend this year, and here they are, so you will know the members of our coalition. They are the Bodhi Oak Zen Sangha, Community United Church of Christ, the Fresno State University Alumni Association and the Ethics Center, First Congregational Church of Fresno, Fresno Pacific University, Fresno City College, the Human Rights Coalition, and that means Dr. Kapoor, who wanted you to know in the box, in the chat box, December 10th, we will be having our human rights celebration, and the topic is human rights of the Indigenous people. So we will be once again working with Kat and everyone else interested in continuing the dialogue over Indigenous rights. The Interfaith Alliance of Central California, the Islamic Center of Fresno, Memorial United Methodist Church, Sophia's House, St. James Cathedral, the Episcopal Cathedral, the Second Church of Christ Scientists, Sikh Council of Central California, St. Paul Catholic Newman Center, Temple Beth Israel, Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno, Wesley United Methodist Church. All of these are members who have made this weekend possible. Third group to thank, people that worked over this particular event, would include Dr. Andrew Fiala and his tremendous student assistant, Ebony Gonzalez Burgos. We want to thank Mark Baker. We want to thank Dr. Darren Dirksen and Susan Taylor and Laura Roberts. We can't forget Katerina Friesen, who is here with us today. We want to thank all of you from the Mennonite community, from the different schools across the country and the Mennonite faith that has been present over this conversation. Fourth point, I want to mention, if we could, two images, if they could be posted at this point. One of them is to let you know that Nikki Singh, who was here in 2016, actually to be our Interfaith scholar, she is going to be back in town on the 26th of this month, brought in to celebrate Sikhism with the Sikh community. That is one thing. I don't know if that image can be seen, but we did want to mention this to know that one of our scholars is coming back to make a visit in person at Pardini's. Lastly, on other posting notes, there's an image of our bishop, along with a friend from Bakersfield, Anna Betancourt. On April 3rd, we will be having a Sing for Peace at the Holy Spirit Catholic Church, 5 o'clock on the 3rd of April, to pray, sing, and be in solidarity with the people of the Ukraine. One of those there will be a Ukrainian Catholic priest who does happen to minister to us here in Clovis. The last point, I think, before we let Katerina talk to us about a letter we'd like you to sign, I'd like to let you know, if you'd like to be involved with the effort to rename S Valley, there is a committee that is working on this tremendously practical and very urgent issue. We are in touch with Dev Holland. We are trying our darndest to get the Board of Supervisors to do the right thing, which they're not apt to do. We want more help on that. If you want to work with Rename S Valley, the person is Roman Raintree, that is the organizer. You could be in touch with me. We'll put you in touch with him. And finally, I think that brings up Kat to talk about the BOS letter. And on that note, I think we'll thank everyone for everything they've done and let Kat close the program. Katerina, thank you for talking about the letter that we need signed by tomorrow so we can send it to the BOS Tuesday. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you so much, Jim. I just wanted to make a plug here. Jim and I are part of a new Interfaith Climate Action Working Group in Fresno. So this is one of the spaces where we can work out what Sabbath economics means here in our region and beyond. One of our first steps last week was to share an open letter from the Interfaith community in Fresno, and that letter is linked in the chat. And we want to share that this Tuesday with the County Board of Supervisors, who recently rejected unanimously state funding for a study on climate change on our region. This study would help us learn more about climate impacts on the most vulnerable peoples in our area. And they cited different reasons for denying that, including the need to listen to the agricultural community and to care for agricultural economy. Of course, we know climate change impacts agriculture in a big way. So we invite you to sign your name on that letter that's in the chat, and also email Jim Grant if you're interested in joining our Interfaith Climate Working Group.